Hello, folks. Now let's focus on the tissue of the nervous system, which is going to be neurons. Now, of course, if you've already taken anatomy, you know a little bit about nervous tissue, but we want to focus on neurons here in physiology as well. So neurons are going to be our communication network of the body. They have the ability to receive signals and transmit signals, which, of course, is a part of the overall function of the nervous system, right? We have that sensory input, we have the integration, then we have the motor input, and that all happens due to neurons. And so the first thing I want to do is look at the anatomy of a neuron, because the anatomy is going to help us figure out the function and why it functions that way. So here we are looking at a multipolar neuron. That means it has two poles. One pole is going to be on the left side here, which is going to have dendrites, and the other pole is going to have axon terminals. And when you're looking at any neuron, because multipolar are not the only type, we'll talk about that next. When you're looking at any neuron, they all have three important parts. They're going to have a cell body, number one. They're also going to have a receptive portion. That means they have the ability to receive messages. And finally, they're going to have a transmitting portion. And of course, that means they can transmit messages or signals. Now, when we're thinking of receptive and transmitting, we definitely are talking about usually electrical signals, because we are talking about the neurons themselves. And sometimes you can also say messages as well, because there are hormones involved too. So let's go ahead and focus on our multineuron here. And what you want to be able to do is just draw a general structure of this. You do not have to be perfect. So for example, I'm going to draw I'll do it over here. I'm going to draw a cell body, and I'm going to draw an axon and some terminal portions, and then a bunch of dendrites that are here on these portions here. Okay, so now let's get into just labeling the anatomy. First, every single neuron is going to have a cell body, and the cell body is going to house the nucleus, okay? And that cell body is going to be seen as the control center, okay? Or you can say the integration center. Remember those three key functions we already talked about. We said that we had the sensory input, the integration center, and the, of course, response, or the motor output. The body is going to be seen as our integration portion, okay? So this is going to be responsible for all the metabolic activities, but also it has the ability to receive some messages as well. And that's going to be very important as we continue to speak. Now, next we're going to have our dendrites. These are going to be these branched extensions coming out of the soma or cell body. As you can see, there's a lot of different amounts of them. They keep on branching. And the whole goal of these dendrites is to receive messages. Okay? So they're going to receive those messages and receive those signals. And once they receive those signals, it's going to travel to the cell body. Once it's in the cell body, those signals, or of course, those messages can then move to or down the axon to create what is called an action potential. And that action potential is then going to go straight to the axon terminals to, again, now transmit that message or signal to other neurons, okay? So if you're thinking of this multipolar neuron, you can say, okay, well, I'll probably have the terminal region of another neuron that is giving messages to this little particular dendrite. I can also have one here, 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 just all around. So that allows us to make sure that these neurons are really going to be our communication network. All right, let's talk about the other main structures. So we got our soma here, our cell body. Got that part. We got our dendrites. Now let's talk about the axon here. As you can see, the axon is going to be a part of our transmitting structure. Now, at the end of the axon, you have the axon terminals. Okay? That's what this is here, the axon terminals. And again, the goal is to make sure that they are going to give that signal that they just received to another neuron, right? So that's how they're able to communicate. And that's literally called the secretory region, because you're going to secrete or release neurotransmitters to communicate with other neurons or effectors as well. Okay? And we're going to go into more detail as we go along with that too. Now, to us, this axon looks super long, right? And the axon doesn't have to be the same length with every single type of neuron. The axon could be shorter, it could be longer. I mean, think about it. If you're talking about the axon trying to go to the muscles in your toe, yes, if it's going from the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system down to the muscles in your toe, you might need some that are very long, but you also can have some that are very short. So what's going to happen is the dendrites are going to receive the message. They're going to move that message down to the cell body. The cell body then going to move that message to a very important region, which is called our trigger zone. Another thing you can call this is the axon hillock. And this is going to initiate that action potential. So we're going to be focused on action potentials and graded potentials as we go along. But what this is really saying is we want to make sure that all the signals we get from the dendrite is going to the cell body. The cell body is going to move that signal to the trigger zone or the axon hillock. And depending on the strength of that signal, it will have the ability to then travel down the axon and get that message to the axon terminal. But that doesn't just happen automatically every single time. You have to get to a certain threshold in order for that trigger zone to say, okay, now we're going to push an action potential through. If you don't get through a threshold, then you will not be pushing the message, transmitting that message down the axon. So we got to keep that in mind as well. So right now we went over our dendrites. They're receiving signals. Our cell body is going to be our control signal, control center, and it also does receive signals as well. Our axon hillock is going to be our trigger zone. So if there's enough of that potential reception of those messages and signals, and you hit a threshold, then it has the ability to create an action potential that travels down the axon and then hits the axon terminals. Once at the axon terminals, they're going to secrete neurotransmitters, and it's usually probably going to be a part of secreting neurotransmitters to, again, send a message to another neuron that has dendrites. And so the process will continue, okay, depending on how much of a signal you want. So just keep that in mind. And we'll get into more details as we go along with this as well. But I did want to stop just to show you the different types, of course, from your textbook as well. So there's 3 types of neurons that we focus on: multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. And again, a lot of the times we focus mainly on the multipolar, especially when you're talking about the overall structure. So one thing we also noticed about our axon, even if we go back to the previous, is that it's kind of wrapped. And it looks like it's wrapped in these tiny little cells here, right? Well, those are called Schwann cells. And when you have axons that are wrapped in these Schwann cells, that creates what's called a myelin sheath. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So a myelin sheath is just going to be a covering of the axon that allows those transmitting signals to move very fast. If we not have our myelin sheath wrapped around the axon that you see here, then the message will go very, very slow. And you don't want messages to go very slow if you need them for different parts of your body. So having the myelin sheath is very important. What's going to happen? You're going to have a Schwann cell, and that Schwann cell is going to wrap around, so you're going to wrap around the axon. So if you have axon here, which we know is going to help transmit signals, then that Schwann cell is going to wrap around it. And so you might be saying, well, how's it going to wrap around it? Well, what's going to happen is it's going to wrap around it so tightly it ends up forcing and pushing out the cytoplasm. And when it pushes out the cytoplasm, now the axon and the Schwann cell are now as one, okay? And so now you actually get a wrapping around that piece of the axon. But then you might be asking, okay, well, how come we just can't have one large Schwann cell? Because these cells are not that large. So because they're very, very small, you have to make sure you have enough of those Schwann cells to go down the entire axon length. So yes, you will be getting another Schwann cell here. You will be having another Schwann cell that's wrapped around here. Okay? Now then your next question might be, what about the gaps in between our Schwann cells? Because they are small, they can't really get everything. So you see some gaps here, and you see a gap here. And those gaps are going to create nodes. So let's say we have a Schwann cell, we have a gap, we have another Schwann cell, we have a gap. They're going to create nodes in between that axon, and they are called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay? The nodes of Ranvier. And what that really means is when you get that signal, and that transmitting signal that's coming from the trigger zone and you go into the axon, that signal has the ability to jump from node to node to node versus having to travel in between every single Schwann cell, which can take a very long time. And so that's the reason why you might say the myelin sheath is extremely important. And we're going to get into more details of this once we actually understand action potentials. Your goal is to just have the general idea right now. Also, we have another photo of an axon in the middle here, and then we do have the myelin sheath that is surrounding it due to a Schwann cell. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. Now, the other type of neurons is going to be bipolar and unipolar. But remember, all neurons have 3 main parts. They have a cell body, so let's find the cell body for all of those. Cell body here, cell body here, cell body here. They're going to have an area of a receptive portion, meaning how they're receiving messages, We know for the multipolar that we're going to be having our dendrites out here to receive messages. And then, of course, we have dendrites on the bipolar here. And then we also have little receptive endings that are for the unipolar. And then finally, we need to have an area to, of course, transmit those signals. And so the transmitting signals here is going to be at the axon terminal. It's going to be at the axon terminal here. And then finally, it's going to be at the axon terminal for the unipolar as well. And just like we saw before, remember, we have the same 3 pieces of the neuron that we're normally looking at, no matter what type, but we also have that axon halo, that trigger zone. And so let's look at the trigger zone for each of those as well. So we have our soma, and we know that when it comes to the cell body, the trigger zone is right next to it, right? So we have our soma here, our cell body, and we have our trigger zone right next to it, okay? Once we hit that trigger zone, then we can have an action potential or the signal actually be transmitted. Over here, we also have our cell body. Let's just go ahead and circle all the cell bodies. Cell body, and then we have a cell body here. And let's go ahead and look at the trigger zone there. Well, if we have a cell body, then the next question is going to be, where is the axon and the axon terminals? Here it's easy because it's the one we're used to. But when it comes to bipolar, you know, if you go to the left, that's going to be all dendrites. So you need to make sure that your trigger zone is going to be right here. And that's going to help the signal transmit down the axon to the axon terminals. Okay? As you can see, many bipolar neurons do not even generate an action potential. Not saying that they can't, but most of them do not. Okay? And because of that, the trigger zone is not in this perfect little area that we normally see. But because we are starting off, we always look at multipolar neurons, which we know the trigger zone is right where it's supposed to be by the cell body. Now let's look at our unipolar. We have our cell body, and your question is, okay, wait a minute, this is an axon here. We have receptive endings, and then we have a, usually we're going to have our transmitting areas as well. So what do? Well, we got to think. We usually have a cell body. That cell body receives information from dendrites, for example, where we're thinking of multipolar, and then there's a trigger zone. So once you hit a threshold, you can have an action potential. But when it comes to unipolar, we see our cell bodies kind of in the middle, and you have the long axon going around it, or, you know, basically below it, as you can see here. Long axon. So the trigger zone is a little bit different area. And we have our receptive endings here. The trigger zone can't be too far away. And that's going to be able to move a signal down through the axon to the transmitting area or the terminal area. Okay, folks, so just keep that in mind as well. Let's go ahead and look at a different piece of this table that comes from your text as well, just to end off the video about neurons. And that's just giving you more functional classes of the neurons. So multipolar, most of them that we're going to talk about are going to be our motor neurons, but they're also seen as interneurons. So inter means clean neuron, okay? So you usually have an interneuron that's going to be able to make sure that that signal is going to be transmitted to a motor neuron to then make a move for the muscle itself. Okay, and this is, again, sensory input or motor output. Then we can have bipolar neurons that are usually going to be for special sense organs like the eye. Those bipolar neurons, again, will still have the same setup like we saw before. They're still going to have their dendrites in the cell body, and it's still going to have a trigger zone right there by that cell body to help those messages come through. Okay? But remember, they don't always have action potentials. And then finally, we have unipolar, and that is going to be mainly sensory neurons as well. And that's just going to help just basically send messages to the central nervous system through afferent pathways. And so a lot of times you'll see them be called the primary first order sensory neurons because that's going to be the one that's going through afferent pathways. Okay? Whereas when you're thinking of multipolar and you have to decide which one is which beyond structure, you'll say multipolar are going to be sending messages from the central nervous system to your actual body or skeletal muscles. That's why you kind of see them as motor neurons. All right, folks, well, that ends our information about neurons. Next thing we're going to get is into the plasma membrane. So this is going to be super cool because it's like when we talked about plasma membrane in previous chapters, mainly going to be like in chapter 3 in membrane transport, and we talked about transport proteins and all those good things, we actually get to see them be applied to the plasma membrane of these neurons. Okay, folks? And the last thing I did want to say is you may be thinking, well, the neurons are only going to be a part of the peripheral nervous system and not the central nervous system, but that does change. Of course, our focus is going to be the peripheral nervous system, especially since you're talking about sensory neurons and things like that. But peripheral nervous system is made of nerves, and that's going to be a bundle of axons. So it's like you have a lot of neurons around it, but the axons are coming into a bundle to form those nerves, okay? So this is coming from many neurons to form the nerves that are just a bundle of axons, okay? And so you might be saying, well, what's going on with the soma? Where's the cell body at? Well, they are going to live in sensory neurons and usually live in the ganglia of those sensory neurons. And another cool thing about the peripheral nervous system is that they usually have those myelin sheaths. And this makes sense because we need those signals to transport very quickly in different parts of the body. Now, when you're thinking of the central nervous system, our brain, our spinal cord, then you're thinking of, yes, bundles of axons, but those bundles of axons, if you're thinking of the brain specifically, is going to form our white matter. You might have heard of different matter in the brain, the white and the gray matter. So the white matter is going to be our bundle of axons. And then the gray matter, that's going to be our where our neuron cell bodies are. Okay? Just to add that in there, just in case anybody is confused by that. All right, folks, I'll see you in the next video, plasma membrane stuff. Bye-bye.